Have you ever wondered what happens to the patient's history forgot? The ones erased from every record, every file, every memory? The demolition crew thought it would be an ordinary job. Knock down the abandoned Ravenswood State Asylum, haul out the debris, and collect their pay. But Ravenswood wasn't ordinary. It was infamous. The asylum had been closed since the early 1970s after a series of unexplained deaths. Over the years, urban explorers broke in, kids dared each other to spend the night, and ghost hunters claimed to hear screams in the dark. But no one stayed long. The place seemed to breathe, as if the walls themselves remembered the madness they once contained. On the first day of demolition, the crew gathered outside the fenced-off compound. The morning fog clung to the ground, wrapping the cracked pavement in a suffocating gray veil. "Looks like hell threw up on this place," muttered Mike, the site supervisor. He spat on the ground and motioned for his men to follow. The asylum loomed before them, 6 stories of rotting brick and broken windows. Ivy crawled up its sides like veins on a corpse. The main entrance doors, once painted white, had turned a sickly yellow. Above them, faded letters still spelled Ravenswood State Hospital for the Insane. Inside, the air was heavy with mold and dust. The halls were lined with peeling paint, and the smell of mildew mixed with something else, something faintly metallic, like dried blood. The first 2 days went smoothly. The crew began clearing out the old wards, tossing broken furniture and rusted bed frames into dumpsters. But on the 3rd day, something strange happened. While ripping apart a filing room on the 2nd floor, one worker named Eddie discovered a locked cabinet bolted into the wall. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside were patient records, hundreds of them, stuffed into thick manila folders. Nothing unusual, except the patient numbers didn't match the hospital's official archives. "Hey Mike, you better take a look at this," Eddie called. Mike squinted at the files. Patient number 31, unknown name. Patient number 32, identity withheld. Every record was incomplete. No birth dates, no next of kin, just notes scribbled in shaky handwriting. And one thing stood out. Each file ended with the same phrase stamped in red ink: "Do not transfer. Do not release." "What the hell?" Mike muttered. That night, Mike took one of the files home. He couldn't shake the unease. Flipping through it, he found disturbing notes. Subject shows signs of advanced schizophrenia, paranoia, violent outbursts. Patient insists someone lives in the walls, refuses food, speaks in whispers to unknown entities. But the last entry froze him. Patient 1031 has disappeared from his cell. Search underway. Possible staff error. Do not report. The file ended there. No closure, no transfer records, just nothing. The next morning, the crew returned. They were tasked with tearing down the old East Wing, where the worst patients had once been kept. Most of the cells were empty, just rusted bed frames and bars, but one door wouldn't budge. "Probably rusted shut," Eddie said, forcing a crowbar between the hinges. But when they finally pried it open, every man in the hallway went silent. The cell looked untouched. While the rest of the asylum had rotted, this room was preserved as if time had stopped. The walls were clean. The sheets on the bed were neatly folded. And on the desk sat a journal, perfectly placed in the center. Mike stepped inside, his boots echoing on the floor. He picked up the journal. The cover was leather, cracked with age. He flipped it open. The first page read, "Patient number 31. My name has been erased. They want me forgotten. But I am still here." The crew exchanged nervous looks. Then, from the corner of the room, they heard it. A whisper, so faint, it was almost impossible to catch. "Leave." Eddie's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" Mike's throat tightened. The whisper came again, slightly louder this time. "Leave this place." The men bolted out of the cell, slamming the door behind them. But as the door clicked shut, the sound echoed through the hallway. The faint scrape of someone dragging their nails across the inside of the door. Mike clutched the journal to his chest, his heart pounding. And for the first time, he realized the truth. The cell had never been empty. Mike didn't sleep that night. The journal sat on his kitchen table, staring at him like an open wound. He had tried, he had tried, to put it away, to shove it back into his duffel bag and pretend it wasn't there. But every time he looked at it, the leather seemed darker, wetter somehow, as if it had been pulled from something still alive. The words replayed in his head. My name has been erased. They want me forgotten. But I am still here. Still here. He poured himself another drink, hoping whiskey would burn away the unease clinging to him, but even that didn't help. At 3:17 a.m., a sound echoed in his house. A faint scratching, like fingernails trailing against wood. His heart stopped. He lived alone. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from his hallway. Mike froze, listening. The scratching moved slowly, dragging across the walls of his narrow corridor until it stopped right outside his bedroom door. He clenched his fists, trying to convince himself it was a rat. Old house, old walls, nothing more. But then came the whisper. Leave. He didn't open the door. He didn't dare. He stayed perfectly still in his bed until dawn bled through the blinds, and only then did the sound fade. By the next morning, Mike looked like hell. Bloodshot eyes, unshaven, and a silence about him that made the rest of the crew uneasy. But he said nothing. He only carried the journal tucked under his arm, as if he couldn't bear to leave it behind. The men gathered in the east wing again, staring at the locked cell they had sworn never to open again. Nobody wanted to talk about what they had heard yesterday, but the silence between them said enough. Let's just seal this section off, Eddie muttered, wiping sweat from his brow even though the morning was cool. Tear down the other side first. We don't need to mess with that. But Mike shook his head. We finished the wing. That's the job. His voice was flat, like someone speaking from a great distance. That cell isn't empty, and we need to know why. The others exchanged glances, but no one argued. You didn't argue with the boss, not when he looked like that. They worked through the morning, clearing the other cells, breaking down rusted doors, ripping apart the walls. Yet every few minutes, someone would glance toward the sealed cell. It sat at the end of the hallway, door bolted shut again, but it felt like an open eye watching them work. Around noon, Eddie wandered too close to it. He swore he heard something moving inside, a shuffle, a slow dragging sound like feet sliding across the floor. He pressed his ear to the cold metal. The whisper came again. Hungry. Eddie stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pile of broken bed frames. His face had gone pale. Mike, he hissed, something's in there. I swear to God, there's something still in that room. The crew laughed nervously, but their voices shook. Nobody wanted to admit it, but they had heard it too. That night, Mike finally opened the journal again. He sat in his truck outside the asylum, engine off, the moonlight barely enough to read the faded handwriting. The entries were strange, half journal, half confession, written in shaky, frantic script. They keep me here because I know the truth. I am not mad. They are. The doctors feed me lies. The walls listen. The walls breathe. If I stop writing, I will cease to exist. I must write to stay alive. The next entry was worse. I hear them at night. The others. Not the patients, the ones behind the walls. They whisper in my voice now. They promise freedom if I let them in. But I know what they are. I know what they want. Mike turned the page with trembling hands. I have stopped eating. They cannot kill me if I am not alive to kill. But I will not die. I will wait. I will wait until they open the door again. Someone always opens the door again. Mike slammed the journal shut, heart pounding. A cold sweat slicked his skin. He looked up at the asylum, its silhouette black against the moonlight. And for the first time since they had started demolition, he felt certain that the building wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. The next morning, the men found the east wing destroyed. At first, they thought vandals had broken in. Bricks smashed, doors ripped from their hinges, debris scattered everywhere. But as they walked deeper into the wing, horror set in. The destruction wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. The walls had been clawed. Deep gouges cut through plaster and brick, long streaks like nails dragged by something desperate or inhuman. And then they saw it. The locked cell door had been torn open from the inside. The bed was overturned, the sheets shredded, the desk splintered, and in the middle of the room, etched deep into the floorboards with what looked like broken fingernails, were 3 words. Still here now. The East Wing was no longer a job site. It was a crime scene. Mike stood frozen in the doorway of the ruined cell, his throat tight, his hands trembling despite himself. He had worked demolition for over 20 years, seen dead animals rotting under floorboards, pulled bodies out of condemned houses that doubled as drug dens. But this was different. This wasn't decay. This was intent. The gouges in the walls weren't the random scratches of a madman. They were words, broken into fragments. Let me in. Still breathing. Feed me. Some were written backward, as if meant to be read from inside the wall itself. And those words carved into the floorboards, still here now, seemed to pulse, like the wood itself throbbed with a heartbeat. The men stood in silence, no one willing to step closer. Finally, Eddie whispered, "This isn't right. We need to stop. Call someone. Police, the city, I don't care who. This ain't just a building anymore." But Mike shook his head. His voice was quiet, almost hollow, but there was a strange weight in it. "No, we keep going. If we walk away now, it'll follow us." "Follow us?" Eddie barked. "Listen to yourself. You sound like one of those lunatics that used to live here." Mike's eyes didn't move from the floor. "Maybe I do. But tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't feel it watching us." And the truth was, they all did. The air in the East Wing felt thicker, heavier. Each breath tasted like rust and ash. The flicker of their work lights made shadows stretch unnaturally long, bending into shapes that seemed almost human before sliding back into the corners. That night, they gathered in the site office, too shaken to go home. Nobody admitted it, but each man was terrified of being alone. The journal lay on the desk between them, its cracked leather cover like a wound none of them wanted to touch. Finally, Eddie snapped. He grabbed the book and flipped it open. "We need answers. I don't care how crazy this crap sounds. Maybe it'll tell us what we're dealing with." The pages seemed to hum under his fingers. The writing grew more frantic with each entry, the patient's words breaking into jagged scrawls, whole paragraphs crossed out violently. But between the madness, certain passages stood out. They said I was violent. They said I attacked the nurses, but I never touched them. It was the shadows, the ones that whisper when the lights go out. They move through the walls like water. They want skin. They want voices. I only screamed to drown them out. The next page. The doctors thought they locked me away, but they locked it away with me. It needs me to open the door. It cannot exist without a host, without a name. That's why they erased me. If I do not exist, neither does it. But it is patient. It waits. And I am growing weak. The men sat in silence. The words seemed to echo inside the room, as if the patient himself were whispering them aloud. Eddie slammed the book shut, his hands shaking. "This is bullshit. Just some crazy guys rambling, that's all." But his denial didn't last. Because when they stepped outside the office, the asylum was different. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing the grounds in a suffocating gray. The floodlights they had set up to illuminate the work site flickered one by one, casting the asylum into half-darkness. And from somewhere inside the East Wing came a sound. Not footsteps, not voices. Something worse, a dragging, slow, deliberate, like something pulling itself across the floor with broken limbs. The men froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was clear it wasn't echoing from inside the building at all. It was circling the office trailer. Eddie swore under his breath, fumbling for the flashlight on his belt. He swung the beam through the fog, but it caught only shifting white mist and the skeletal outline of the asylum beyond. Nothing. Then, tap. The sound of fingers drumming lightly against the thin metal wall of the trailer. Tap, tap, tap. Moving along the length of it, circling. "Who the hell is out there?" Eddie shouted, his voice cracking. The tapping stopped. Silence pressed in like a vice. And then, in the same whisper they had heard inside the cell, it came again, clear, close, as if someone were speaking directly into their ears. "You opened the door!" The lights inside the trailer exploded all at once, showering them with sparks. In the split-second darkness that followed, something heavy slammed against the side of the trailer hard enough to rattle the walls. The men stumbled back, panic breaking through their bravado. Mike clutched the journal tight against his chest, his face pale. And then came the final sound, the unmistakable creak of the trailer's back door slowly swinging open on its own. The silence after the door creaked open was worse than the noise. The men stood frozen inside the trailer, their bodies rigid, breaths held as though exhaling might call the thing inside. The night pressed heavy around them, the fog smothering even the pale light of the moon. Mike's knuckles whitened around the journal. Eddie gripped a wrench like a weapon, though he had no illusions it would matter against whatever had followed them. For a moment, nothing moved. The open door gaped black, a mouth yawning into emptiness. Then the cold came. A wave of air that didn't belong, colder than any night breeze, rolling in from the threshold. It carried a smell with it, something sour and damp, the scent of mildew and rot that clung to old basements and long-sealed tombs. "Close it," Eddie hissed. His voice cracked with terror. Close it now." But none of them moved. Their feet seemed anchored, their bodies paralyzed by the invisible weight of dread. It wasn't just fear. It was obedience, as though something in the fog commanded them to stay still, to listen. And then the whisper came again. "You shouldn't have read it." The journal in Mike's arms seemed to vibrate faintly, the pages shifting as though stirred by a breath that didn't come from him. His stomach twisted. A thought, terrible and undeniable, slid into his mind. The book isn't just a record, it's a cage. And I've broken the lock. At last, Eddie snapped free from the paralysis. He lunged forward, slammed the door shut, and braced his back against it, gasping. The others jolted as though released from invisible strings. But the damage was done. The air was different now, thick and alive with something unseen. That night, none of them dared leave the site. They clustered inside the trailer, jumping at every groan of the asylum's skeletal frame in the distance. Sleep was impossible. Some stared at the walls. Others kept their eyes fixed on the journal, daring it to move. By morning, 2 of the men were gone. No one had seen them leave. No sound had stirred them awake. Their bunks were simply empty, sheets cold, boots missing from the floor. The others searched the grounds in a panic, but the fog swallowed every footprint, and the asylum loomed like a silent witness. Eddie broke down, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "We're cursed. We need to burn this place to the ground, bury the ashes, something. I'm not sticking around to be next." Mike, however, was calm. Too calm. His eyes were bloodshot, sleepless, but steady. He ran a hand across the cracked leather journal as though soothing it. "If we run, it'll follow. The patient said so. It needs someone to remember. If we leave without finishing this, we'll carry it with us forever." Eddie stared at him, horrified. "Listen to yourself. You're starting to sound like him." But Mike only shook his head. "No, I'm starting to understand him." Later that day, they returned, reluctantly, to the East Wing. The wreckage of the torn cell remained, but something new had appeared. On the wall outside the room, written in a dark, wet scrawl that hadn't been there the day before, was a message. "They erased my name. Give me yours." The men recoiled in terror, but Mike stepped closer. His breath fogged in front of him as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in that one hallway. He ran his fingers lightly over the letters. They weren't painted. They were gouged into the plaster, the grooves fresh and damp as though carved with something not quite human. That night, the journal grew heavier. Mike could feel it, literally feel the weight increasing in his hands. He opened it again, desperate for answers. The entries near the back were smeared, almost illegible, but fragments broke through. The thing cannot exist without a name. Without someone to hold it, it drifts, half-formed, in the dark. That is why they erased me. I am the wound they sealed shut. But wounds reopen. Doors reopen. All it takes is one curious hand, one fool to look inside the box. And now the box is open again. Beneath the scrawled text was something even worse. Not words, but drawings. Childlike, frantic sketches of faces, bodies bent at unnatural angles, mouths stretched too wide. And in every drawing, the patient's own face was scribbled out. No eyes, no mouth, no features. As Mike stared at the images, a thought slithered through his mind, unbidden, like it wasn't his own. He was never a patient. He was the lock, and we just broke it. The next evening, the asylum showed its teeth. The crew was working near the central stairwell when the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the building into suffocating dark. Panic erupted as flashlights were fumbled on, beams slicing wildly through the black. One worker screamed, a raw, strangled sound, then cut off abruptly. When the others swung their lights toward the sound, they froze. The missing worker was there, but not as he had been. His body hung halfway through the wall, torso swallowed by brick, as though the asylum itself had eaten him. His legs kicked weakly, boots scraping against the floor, while his hands clawed at the plaster. His mouth opened in a silent scream, eyes bulging with impossible terror. Then the wall closed, just closed, swallowing him whole. The corridor was silent again. Eddie dropped his flashlight, his voice shaking. "It's in the walls. Dear God, it's in the walls." Mike didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the journal clutched to his chest. His lips moved without sound, repeating something over and over. When Eddie leaned closer, he heard the whisper, "Still here now. Still here now. Still here now." And in that moment, Eddie realized with a gut-sickening certainty that Mike wasn't fighting it anymore. He was listening. By the fifth night, the asylum no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. The men huddled in the trailer were a fraction of the crew that had first arrived. Out of 12, only 5 remained. The rest had vanished into the walls or walked into the fog and never returned. No screams carried, no evidence left behind. Just absence, the kind that gnawed at the stomach like hunger. Eddie hadn't slept in days. He sat by the door with a crowbar across his lap, jerking awake at every sound, every faint creak of the asylum shifting in the night. His eyes were rimmed red, his skin pale, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "It's playing with us," he whispered to no one in particular. "Like a cat. We're mice, and it's just waiting for us to give up." Across the room, Mike sat hunched over the journal again, the cracked leather cover glowing faintly in the dull lamplight. He turned the pages slowly, reverently, his lips moving in silent repetition of the patient's words. He was thinner now, hollow-eyed, like the asylum had begun feeding on him directly. Eddie couldn't stand it anymore. "You've been glued to that damn book since the first day. Don't you see what it's doing to you? You're starting to sound like him." Mike lifted his head slowly. His pupils were wide, swallowing most of the iris, and when he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that made Eddie's blood run cold. He wasn't mad. They locked him away because he knew the truth. This place isn't haunted. It isn't cursed. It's hungry, and he was the one keeping it contained. "Bullshit," Eddie snapped, standing. That thing in the walls isn't contained by anyone. It's eating us alive. Mike's mouth curved into a thin, humorless smile. Not alive, not dead either. It feeds on names, on memory. That's why they erased him. They thought if he didn't exist, neither would it. But someone always remembers. Someone always writes it down. And now it has me. The other men shifted uneasily, muttering under their breath, avoiding Mike's eyes. No one wanted to admit it, but he was right about one thing. The asylum felt more alive with every passing hour, as if feeding on their fear, their attention. The building groaned at night like it was breathing, the walls pulsing faintly in rhythm, doors swelling shut and releasing again like muscle and flesh. The following day, they tried to leave. Eddie demanded it, shoving the others toward the trucks, insisting they'd rather take their chances running through the fog than wait around to be swallowed whole. But the gates were gone. Where the chain-link fence had stood was nothing but mist stretching endlessly into gray. They drove in circles for hours, headlights cutting through the void, but every road bent back toward the asylum. Every mile carried them back to the same broken sign at the entrance. Ravenswood State Hospital for the Insane. By evening, Eddie sat on the ground with his face in his hands. We're never getting out, he whispered. Mike didn't disagree. He only returned to the journal, tracing the words with his finger as though memorizing every curve of every letter. That night, the writing changed. When he opened to the latest page, it was blank at first. Then, before his eyes, ink began to spread across the surface, curling into words in the same frantic scrawl as before. You've opened the door. You've read the words. You've given me form. Soon you will take my place. Mike felt his heart stutter, but he didn't close the book. Instead, a calm washed over him, the calm of inevitability. He looked up at the others, his voice low and distant. It doesn't want all of us. Just one to hold its name again. Eddie leapt to his feet, horror etched across his face. Don't you dare! Don't you fucking dare start talking about sacrifice! But even as he said it, the walls groaned, plaster cracking, dust sifting down from the ceiling. A deep sound rumbled through the asylum, something between a growl and a sigh. The floor vibrated under their boots. The men scrambled, clutching tools, weapons, anything at hand. But the sound wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from beneath them. The floorboards of the trailer bulged upward, swelling as though something beneath was pressing against them. Nails shrieked as wood split. Eddie screamed, swinging his crowbar, but the boards burst open in a shower of splinters. From the darkness below, a hand reached up. Not a living hand, not bone and flesh. It was pale and stretched too long, the fingers jointed in odd places, bending both ways as though it had forgotten how to mimic the human form. Nails, no, claws, raked across the air. Another hand followed, then an arm, impossibly thin, skin hanging in folds. The men scrambled back as the thing pulled itself upward, its face emerging last. And though its features were smeared and wrong, they recognized it immediately. It was the missing worker, the one who had been swallowed by the wall. His mouth hung open too wide, jaw cracked, his eyes black pits. His voice was not his own when he spoke. One of you must stay. One of you must wear the name, or none of you will leave. The thing lunged forward, scattering them into the night. The fog swallowed their screams. In the chaos, Eddie grabbed Mike's arm, shaking him violently. We need to burn the book! It's the key! It's holding it here! But Mike only clutched it tighter, a strange calm in his eyes. His whisper cut through the noise like a blade. No. If we destroy it, there will be nothing to hold it at all. The storm outside raged like it had been waiting for this night, tearing at the decrepit asylum walls as though nature itself wanted the truth to come spilling out. The hallways groaned, wind howling through broken windows, carrying with it a whisper, low, guttural, and almost human. Mark, trembling, held the folder close to his chest, his flashlight shaking wildly as he tried to read through the last few pages of the patient file. His lips moved silently, repeating the same phrase over and over again. Admitted, 1943, never released, status, lost. Every page told a story of procedures done in secret, experiments hidden from the state, the kind of cruel practices asylum history books often glanced over but never fully confessed. But what made his stomach churn wasn't the torture. It was the handwriting. Every single entry, every single note was written by the same hand. Dr. Elias Harrow, head physician of Blackwood Asylum. And at the very bottom, one sentence written in a hurried scrawl, smeared in dark ink that looked too much like dried blood. Patient Zero is aware. The room seemed to press inward, the walls breathing, the shadows leaning closer as Mark realized what it meant. This wasn't just a patient. This wasn't a man at all. This was something Harrow had awakened, or perhaps created. And now, in the silence between lightning strikes, Mark heard it. A low, hollow breathing echoing through the cell corridor. He turned his flashlight toward the end of the hall. The beam barely reached, but he saw the faintest outline. Something tall, far taller than any man, standing perfectly still. Its body was thin, unnatural, its limbs just a fraction too long, its head cocked at an angle like it was studying him. And then, with a sickening crack of bone, it moved. Mark stumbled backward, his boot catching on a broken tile as his light flickered. He forced himself to focus on the file again, scanning the notes for something, anything that explained what he was dealing with. His eyes froze on one last detail. Patient records not archived. File hidden in duplicate form. Whoever finds this, do not acknowledge them. Do not speak. Do not look directly into their eyes. The words burned in his mind as his flashlight steadied. The figure was closer now. Its head tilted further, impossibly, grotesquely. Mark's breath quickened. He remembered the line, "Do not look into their eyes," but it was too late. The figure stepped forward, and the light revealed its face, or what was left of it. Hollow sockets where eyes should be, stretched skin across bones that had no right belonging to a human skull, and yet somehow, in the emptiness, Mark saw movement, saw awareness. The thing had no eyes, yet it was staring straight into him, burrowing into the deepest part of his mind. Mark screamed, stumbling back, clutching his head as the whispers poured into him. He wasn't hearing them with his ears, he was hearing them inside his skull. Fragments of voices layered over each other, patients begging, crying, screaming. 1,000 lost souls all speaking through this one mouthless horror. "You opened the cell!" The voice was inside him, deep and thunderous, yet eerily calm. "You let me out!" Mark dropped the folder, pages scattered across the floor like dead leaves in a storm. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing like gunshots down the endless corridor. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear it. Those dragging footsteps, impossibly fast, impossibly close. The storm outside tore open part of the ceiling as Mark burst into the main atrium, rain pouring in through the broken roof. The whole building felt like it was collapsing, timbers groaning under the weight of decades. And in the center of the room stood something he hadn't noticed before, a huge iron door, welded shut, chains wrapped tightly around it. Lightning illuminated the writing carved deep into the metal. "Do not open. Patient Zero." Mark froze, his chest heaving, realization hitting him like ice water. The cell he opened earlier wasn't the true cell. It was only a holding chamber. The real prison was here, locked and buried beneath chains and steel. But then, if Patient Zero was supposed to be behind that door, slowly, painfully, his head turned. The figure was standing right behind him. Its breath was cold against his neck, its hollow sockets pouring an endless blackness into the air, consuming the light around it. And for the first time, Mark understood the final, horrific truth. Patient Zero was not a single man or a failed experiment. Patient Zero was the asylum itself. Every tortured scream, every lost patient, every experiment had fed into this one entity, growing, watching, waiting. The asylum was never abandoned. It was never empty. It had been alive all along, and Mark had just given it a voice again. The lights died, the storm stopped, and silence fell across Blackwood Asylum. When the demolition crew returned 2 days later, they found the building standing completely intact, untouched by the storm. But there was no sign of Mark. Only his flashlight lying in the atrium, its beam pointing toward the chained iron door. Chains that were no longer broken, but reforged tighter than ever, as though welded from the inside, and carved freshly into the floor as if written by a hand trembling in its final moments, were words no one could explain. The patient has been transferred. Check the new records.